Should we hit on Sesame Street? Because I remember this as a kid. As a kid, it terrified me. Big Bird terrified me, and that big monster with the it's kind of like big and purple with a massive mouth. My mum was telling me I had to hide behind the settee. I was mortified. But it wasn't until the Star Wars actors came on the show, and we didn't get the show like you did. We got it obviously a bit later. So, but yeah, I mean, until then I could watch it because I was only young.
Yeah.
But how did that come about? Was that just let's get Star Wars and everything? Because I mean, we see quite a lot of Star Wars actors that did appear in character on various programs and musical shows and all sorts. So how did that happen? Did they approach you?
Well, actually, I approached them. Again, what we wanted to do between Star Wars and Empire was keep interest up in the Star Wars universe, to keep having things come out so people would have Star Wars in their minds. And so we were always looking for ways to do that. Licensing the comic books, the novelization, that sort of thing. And it occurred to me, I don't even remember why. I might have known that someone had guest starred on Sesame Street or something. I really don't remember why I came up with the idea, but it occurred to me that Sesame Street's a good place to have kids and their parents see something. So I contacted Sesame Street and discussed it with them, and they said they would love to have, R2 and 3PO on the show. Droids are great. And so we worked it out. I mean, it was free to Sesame Street. They paid our expenses, but we figured out dates. We made sure Tony Daniels was available because we wanted him to play 3PO. And they wrote scripts, which they sent to me for approval, because obviously we're not expecting Sesame Street to do anything that is inappropriate. You're not going to see sex scenes on Sesame Street. But
I hope not.
Yeah. That's a bit more educational than I think parents wanted. But we still wanted to make sure that the characters always acted in character.
Yeah.
They were always true to who they were in the Star Wars universe. And really the only problem I had with any of their scripts was there was one segment where they sing the ABCs, and they have R2 singing the ABC song. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that song. And I said, no, we can't do that. R2 doesn't talk. And they said, oh, well, we figured this out. We can use a synthesizer and have him make noises that are sort of like beeps, but they're sort of like letters like A, B, that sort of thing. And I said, no. If he could make phonetic letter sounds, he can talk. He can't talk. R2 can't sing the alphabet. So it was a simple change. C-3PO sings the alphabet song with Sesame Street characters, and R2 beeps and dances around. And that was really the only significant script change I can remember. Then we had an adventure where everyone had forgotten that Tony was going to need a work visa. Come and do this. And we hadn't arranged for it, and Sesame Street hadn't arranged for it. And I was like, oh, and I called our, I guess it's immigration. I don't know who handles visas. And they were like, oh, well, he's in a costume and his face is covered. So immigration policy is they should hire an American actor. And you're dealing with civil servants who have a list of rules, and don't think beyond the rules. It's like, no, the costume is molded to his body and it's his voice. But they were like, no. So I tried to think of who I could access who had power. Jimmy Carter was president of the US at the time, and his daughter Amy was a big Star Wars fan. And I thought about calling her, because maybe she could then ask her.
Nothing like going to the top.
Yes, well, but I thought I really don't know how to call her, and then she'd have to go to him, and that was probably not too feasible. So I called. Every state has 2 senators, and one of our senators was a man named Alan Cranston, who was very, very powerful. He was been in the Senate a long time. He was one of the backroom deal makers. So he was very well known and very powerful. And so I called him. As senators who have to get elected have local offices. And so I called his LA office and I talked to one of his assistants and I explained that, the world's most popular movie wants to put 2 of children's most popular characters on the most popular children's show in the world during what had been declared by the United Nations the International Year of the Child. And so could he help me get a work visa for Tony to come in to do these appearances on Sesame Street? And they put me on hold and they came back and they said, call this department at immigration in New York, which is where everything would be happening, and they should be able to help us. And I said, great. And I called immigration and I talked to someone who said, oh, well, it takes, we can do it, but it takes 6 weeks to get it processed. And we needed it in like a week. And I said, well, Senator Cranston said you could do this for me. And he put me on hold. And 2 minutes later, he came back and said, okay, if you can have someone at my office by the end of the day today, which was a Friday, they could have the visa in London for Tony to pick up on Thursday, which is the day he was flying in. So I called the general counsel at Sesame Workshop, back then it was called Children's Television Workshop, and said, I just discovered your people didn't get Tony a visa. And he was like, oh my God, what can we do? And I said, don't worry, I've fixed it. You need to send someone to this immigration office and sign these documents, and they'll take care of it. And they were very grateful that I had solved their slip up, which of course was my slip up too, because I hadn't thought of it until, 2 days before. But at least I thought of it. And so he went and signed the document, and Tony got picked up at his house by a limo we sent. They got driven to the American Embassy, picked up the visa, drove on to Heathrow, and flew to New York. And we did the shows.
That's such a great story.
I think it was more down to the fact that they knew you'd played Darth Vader. You were writing letters as Darth Vader. They were terrified of you. That's what it was.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone was terrified of me, but they were certainly terrified of Alan Cranston.
Yeah, he sounds like a powerful guy to get it done that quickly, isn't he? Don't mess with him.
So how was Tony Daniels to work with? Was he all right with the singing and the dancing and the puppets and what have you?
Tony was great. I don't know if you've met Tony or talked to him. Um, but he was a good guy. That wasn't the first time I'd met him, but he was very good to work with. He was easy. He needed to be taken care of the way you would imagine. We had people to dress him in the C-3PO costume, and he could only be in it so long and that sort of thing. But we knew that, and so we dealt with that. He was not anyway difficult. The first night we all arrived. My team from LA and Tony from London. We arrived in New York, and we met up at our hotel, which was the St. Regis, one of the fabled New York hotels. And we got in a cab, and he wanted to drive around through Greenwich Village because even back then there was a huge costume presence in Greenwich Village. And so we spent a couple hours driving around, maybe not a couple hours, maybe it was only an hour, driving around looking at all the people in costume. And then we all went out to dinner and, got picked up the next day for Sesame Street. And, it was great. We had a good time. And, I saw Tony other times. I did an interview with him in LA we did for Bantha Tracks. And I gave him, at his request, some ad-lib insults for R2-D2, one of which actually is in the movie, is in Empire.
Oh, which line was that?
When in the early part, in the ice cave sequence, when 3PO and R2 are standing by the door worried about Luke Skywalker, and R2 goes running into the cave, 3PO calls him a miserable little short circuit.
Fabulous.
Since all that stuff was added in looping, I gave it to him actually after I gave it to him while we were doing Sesame Street, and then when he looped the movie a few months later, he recalled some of the ad libs I gave them, and since you don't have lip flap, you don't see 3PO's mouth moving. He could change the dialogue however he liked.
Wow!
And you've already told us that you were Darth Vader in a way. And on Sesame Street, you were also R2-D2, weren't you? From a certain point of view.
Yes, from a certain point of view, for Sesame Street and for other events, the Oscars, commercials, commercials for licensees. That sort of thing, we would use the radio control R2. And on some of those occasions, I didn't operate him for the Oscars. Sesame Street, in the much remarked upon Underoos commercial, some award shows and other events, I operated R2. Occasionally I would drive R2, but most of the time I would operate R2's head.
Wow, that's a claim to fame and a half.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very popular with the R2 builders. They invite me to their parties and stuff, which is great because I love going there and talking to them and seeing, an entire sea of R2s and other droids, arranged, and they have little. The first time I went to an R2 builder party, because I was actually teaching a class in screenwriting that day, I got there in the late afternoon, and they were having a mouse droid competition out on the street in front of the house where the party was taking place, and all these people with mouse droids were driving them around and driving them into each other and driving them in, fun, fancy patterns and stuff. And every now and then someone would yell "car," and we'd all have to move to the side and while a car drove by. And then the mouse droids would go back out again. Anyway, the R2 builders are great.
So was the original R2 easy to control? Because we've heard some horror stories about how the robots would malfunction on set.
By the time I was driving R2, he had been refined. The R2s on location and on stage for Star Wars, it was still all new, and there were a lot of problems. R2 would go straight, for a distance and then suddenly veer off to the side. Cuts exist in the film where they do because that's where R2 stopped going straight. And so it was very difficult. I mean, radio control technology obviously existed before Star Wars, but it had its problems, especially in places, in certain locations. There was a lot of mountains or hills, in sound stages where there was a lot of other radios going by. We'd occasionally, when we were doing Sesame Street, some taxi cab would drive by the stage and use its, walkie-talkie like radio, and suddenly we'd get a glitch in R2, that sort of thing, because it suddenly clicked in the radio band. It's gotten much more sophisticated. I mean, I'm always amazed because we had these two large radio control devices that you were required to operate R2 in even the rudimentary ways we could operate him. Now, today, I go see R2s with modern radio control technology, and one guy is driving R2 using his phone as the controller and getting R2 to do things we could never come close to doing. We just didn't have the technology then. So, they can open the panels, they can have, something pop out. A couple guys I know have built R2s that will deploy the third leg, based on a command. That's, we couldn't do that. That was not possible. They can spin the head around and around and around. We could only turn, I don't know, maybe 270 degrees, 3/4 of the way around, because there were cables inside R2's head that would get tangled if you turned him too far.
Yeah, it's incredible what some other guys can do now. And in fact, two of the R2 builders were taken on by Lucasfilm for The Force Awakens, weren't they? Which is the ultimate accolade.
Yeah.
And before we leave the subject of Sesame Street, Craig, I've got to ask, I mean, it must have been so wonderful for the Sesame Street crew to have two superstars like R2 and 3PO and the crew coming in. But was it equally a thrill for you to meet Big Bird?
Oh, absolutely. It was funny because all of the Sesame Street people wanted their photo taken with R2 or 3PO or both. And of course, my team was like, yeah, it's R2, it's 3PO. We were like, oh, can I have my picture taken with Big Bird? And for the Sesame Street guys, yeah, it's Carol. Yeah, sure. It's okay with us. It's okay with Carol. So yeah, we were starstruck by the Sesame Street characters, and the Sesame Street people were marveling over the droids. So yeah, it's who you're used to dealing with.
That's fantastic. It's a real meeting of two wonderful genres. That's it is a great piece of television.
And it's wonderful. And it's, we did, I think, 5 segments two of which appear in one episode, and the other three were in separate episodes. But you can find all of them now, just like pretty much everything else, on YouTube.
Exactly. This is where this interview will go eventually as well. So everything ends up at YouTube eventually.
Hello there. You may remember me from The Empire Strikes Back. Now, don't forget to hit subscribe and also click the bell for notifications.